This is the training on the Oregon REALTORS Form 1.9, the invitation to escalate. So there are two versions of an escalation. There's the escalation clause and what we've got in this form, which is the invitation to escalate. An escalation or an escalator clause is ordinarily something that creates an automatic increase to an offer to beat a competing offer or to improve your offer in some way that sweetens the deal enough that you are able to be the accepted offer. It usually has a pre-established limit, but there are escalations that go to an unlimited number. The example would be, for instance, if the seller receives an offer to purchase the property with a purchase price that is greater than the purchase price in the attached offer, my purchase price will automatically increase to $1,000 above whatever the other offer's purchase price was. I will automatically beat whatever they offer. Now, escalation clauses themselves, as opposed to an invitation to escalate, an escalation clause is essentially a low-effort version of making sure that you have the best offer. It is a concise, singular way of establishing your offer as the highest or best offer based on whatever competitors do. It does not necessarily move the buyer's price if there is no other buyer who is present willing to offer a greater value. So the benefit of an escalation clause is essentially you say, I will offer the highest price only if someone else is offering a higher number. If I'm the only buyer, there is no escalation because there's nothing to escalate to. Now, escalation clauses operate automatically, typically. This means that if you have a higher offer that is brought in, your price on your offer will automatically rise to meet the competing offer. And this can create some issues. For example, when there are multiple offers that both have escalation clauses, it rapidly and instantly maxes out both escalations as high as they can go until one of them is beaten. It's essentially two parties saying, I'll beat the other guy by $1,000, and it just keeps on ratcheting up and ratcheting up. If you technically have two offers that have an escalation clause with no limitation on it, and both of them are brought in, they both escalate until an infinite number is reached. That's absurd and it doesn't work at contracting, and so that's a huge problem, and it's the reason why all escalation clauses should have a limit to them. There are some times as well where a buyer is going to use an escalation clause as a deal sweetener, but they don't actually mean to. A buyer pins the needle on how much they can offer. They're doing all cash or something, and they say, I'll offer $400,000 and I'll escalate to beat anybody by $5,000 up to $600,000. But if the buyer really only has $400,000, they don't have the money to escalate. But putting the escalation clause in makes their offer look a lot better. And so some buyers properly, it's admittedly an improper action, use an escalation as a way to sweeten the deal without considering the ramifications, and that can create radical problems later on in your transaction. Open-ended escalations that don't have a limitation on it can create unintended purchase prices. If your buyer is not actually expecting the escalation, or if they want to escalate to a certain number and they just don't put in a limit and it goes over that, the buyer may see this as an unfair scenario where they are suddenly paying more than they wanted to, which is why you want to make sure you very clearly talk with your client if you are going to do an escalation, using an escalation clause that is automatic. There can also be some confusion about when a better offer arrives after mutual acceptance. Most of the time, an escalation clause is something that says it will escalate my offer to be better than whatever else you get. And oftentimes it's something that's baked into the accepted offer. What that means is you'll have many situations where you have an offer that is accepted and they will escalate that offer after the fact. There will be mutual acceptance at a set number, $250,000 for the house, and then sometime later on another offer will come up in a backup position that's offering a little bit more, and the buyer who has a locked-in purchase price suddenly has to move the price up because a better offer has come in. If the escalation clause is not written to very expressly limit when the escalation can occur, you can create very realistic problems later on down in the transaction. That is why the Oregon Realtors documents are not an escalation clause, rather it is an invitation to escalate. This does not create an automatic escalation. It is not an automatic process. Rather, it is facilitating a counteroffer at an escalated price. It is an expression of the buyer's willingness to offer a higher price if somebody else looks like they're offering a higher price, but it is not an automatic process. For lack of a better description, it is just a facilitating document. It does not actually change the terms of the offer. The escalation clause itself is automatic. The invitation to escalate disconnects the automatic nature from that. It makes it more difficult for a buyer to unintentionally overpromise because ultimately the buyer has to accept whatever terms the parties are agreeing in somewhat what amounts to a counteroffer. This also cuts off that better offer comes in after acceptance question because that will never be a part of an invitation to escalate. It does not, however, create a seamless transition upon the receipt of a better offer, and it does require some assembly. That is a weakness of the invitation to escalate that is seen as a trade-off compared to the problems that can occur with automatic escalation. So while if you have an escalation clause that is automatic, a better offer comes in, boom, the price is different. For an invitation to escalate, a better offer comes in, you have to do some more steps. Side-by-side comparison of the two. Escalation clauses, they are made in the offer with an escalation clause. Similarly, an invitation to escalate, the offer is made, it has an invitation to escalate. The escalation clause, you can accept the offer and provide proof of a higher or better offer at the same time, thereby escalating the price that you are accepting. Or you can accept an offer and at times a later offer can come in some sort of a backup position, and then you'll escalate the price of your current buyer at that later moment after mutual acceptance. Generally, the purchase price is escalated per the clause itself, so the escalation clause is the whole kind of automatic process in a box all by itself. In the invitation to escalate, prior to the seller's acceptance of an offer, the seller has to provide proof of a higher and better offer and demand that the buyer amend their offer, that they changed the offer. It is essentially a statement by the buyer that says, here are the terms I'm willing to move to if you can prove to me someone does better. The buyer has to agree to escalate, to change their offer. Otherwise, it's simply rejected. The first real section of unique information in the invitation to escalate is section 3. It is the description of the addendum. It provides all of the explanation of how the concept of an invitation to escalate works. Essentially, the seller will receive an offer from the buyer. The buyer's offer will contain an invitation to escalate. Alongside their offer, it's a portion of the offer. It's essentially an addendum that comes with it. The seller can return that escalation to the buyer and provide proof that they have a better or higher or different offer that they want this buyer to match. At that point, the buyer can agree and modify the terms of their offer. It essentially is something that says, I want you to modify your offer, ending that you counteroffer and change the terms of your offer, buyer, because somebody else is going to win the property if you don't make this change. The next section of the invitation to escalate is the purchase price escalation section. This has the terms for what the buyer or seller are willing to offer, how much the escalation will go up by. It begins with the net purchase price of the buyer's offer or counteroffer will increase to a net purchase price that is X number of dollars greater than the net purchase price of the competing offer. Please note, this is a net purchase price, which is the stated purchase price in the sales agreement, adjusted down for monetary credits to the buyer, or adjusted up for monetary credits to the seller. So if the buyer offers $100,000 for a property and also asks for $5,000 in buyer closing costs to be paid by the seller, the net purchase price would be $95,000. Essentially, you would take the buyer's offer number and subtract all the stuff the seller is supposed to be paying and add all the stuff the buyer is supposed to be paying that otherwise would have been a seller cost. That net purchase price is going to be the number that we work with here. This ensures that essentially concessions don't come a way to skirt around an escalation. You then value those concessions into your purchase price and you analyze whether or not you are escalating or not escalating based upon those concessions in addition to the purchase price itself. The next section has waiver of terms. This is a somewhat unique provision that we have in the invitation to escalate, where the buyer is able to waive various specific terms within their sales agreement. At times, a buyer's offer will be more or less compelling based on things that are other than just the purchase price. A seller may wish to sell their house to a buyer based on the fact that buyer is not doing inspections or based on the fact that buyer is not doing an appraisal, as opposed to just strictly based off of the purchase price. And so because the invitation to escalate operates as essentially like a request for a forced counteroffer, you can put in waiver of terms provisions as well. In this, the buyer essentially says, I am willing, if you can prove to me that someone else is waiving their inspection, I'll waive my inspection. If nobody else is waiving inspections, I want mine. But if someone else waives it, and that would have been the turning point that cost me this offer, I will waive my inspection. If your buyer is waiving their rights using this form, they need to receive a copy of Form 2.14 that has a description of all of the things that can be waived and sort of the gravity of that waiver so that they understand what risk they're taking on. But just be aware, the buyer has the ability to, in addition to telling the seller, I'm willing to move my purchase price to a certain number, they can also say, I'm willing to change the terms. I'm not beholden to getting an SPDS. I don't have to have that document. I will waive it if someone else is willing to waive it. I don't have to take that right because I want this house more than I want a seller's property disclosure statement. The buyer has that right. After that, you have a section on multiple offers. The seller is only ever able to send one competing offer to the buyer. The proof that triggers the buyer's escalation will come from a single competing offer. The seller is only ever able to accept one offer, so the buyer is only going to be held to the terms of one offer. Essentially, if the seller says, I have a better offer, the buyer is supposed to beat only that better offer. The seller cannot cobble together several offers. Well, this one has a higher purchase price. This one has a better inspection waiver. This one has a waiver of the rights to do a lead inspection. I want you to do all of that at once. Well, no, you have to take one offer that the seller would have otherwise accepted and say, buyer, if you can beat this offer that I would have otherwise accepted, then I'll go with you. You can't mix everything together. The buyer could still theoretically choose to make those waivers if they wanted to, but the invitation to escalate does not do that. It is worth noting, this section 8, seller's discretion, the seller never has to just accept the buyer's offer. Having an escalation does not mean you always win. Even though your purchase price might be better, even though you might be waiving more provisions or more conditions, the seller has the ultimate discretion to make the decision that they choose. They do not have to pick the highest or the best offer. The seller can pick the offer that they feel fits them most appropriately. And so that does not mean you can use an invitation to escalate and guarantee success. It just helps with finding success. The last section of the first piece of the invitation to escalate is the buyer's escalation invitation. The buyer will send an offer in that has the invitation to escalate. On section 9, it says, by signing below, I, the buyer, am providing you with this invitation to escalate, but I won't be bound by anything here until I agree to be bound by those terms. It essentially says, by signing this, I'm showing you what I'm willing to go to, my maximum numbers, my maximum terms, but I want you to prove to me that I have a good reason for wanting to max that out. I can go higher, but I only go higher if someone else already has. After that, we get into the next chunk of the invitation to escalate. This has the seller's terms, the seller's instructions. It essentially says, if you have a buyer's offer, prior to accepting it, before you accept the buyer's offer, you can show that buyer a competing offer. You can say, buyer, somebody else made a better offer. Would you like to change your terms before I accept their better offer? You're supposed to present evidence of that competing offer. You should redact all personally identifying information of the other buyer. So don't put their name in it. Don't put their home address if you have that. You can redact that information, but just provide a competing offer that proves what that other party is offering. They were offering the following net purchase price, the following terms. That's why I want you to change your offer. For a competing offer to trigger this invitation to escalate, it needs to be a good faith, valid offer. The seller can't just have their sibling or their cousin write them an absolutely Cadillac offer that triggers everything in the buyer's offer. That would be fraudulent. We don't encourage that. The competing offers need to change certain terms, and they have to have other elements that can't be present. So there are some things that we do not consider as triggering an invitation to escalate. For instance, if the invitation to escalate's competing offer that the seller sends, if the competing offer has a seller financing, it says, here's my purchase price, but I'm not using a bank. Instead, seller, I'm going to be on a promissory note with you. That's radically different from a regular run-of-the-mill transaction on a mortgage, so it's not going to trigger the invitation to escalate in the same way because the terms are so different, even if the person using seller financing was offering a substantially better purchase price. We're not going to count that as something that inherently triggers this invitation to escalate because it's so different. Similarly, if there was an agreement to pay the purchase price after closing, if there was an agreement to set closing for more than 90 days after mutual acceptance, so some radically long closing date, if there is a late offer or otherwise an expired offer that is subject to a late acceptance addendum, you can't use an expired offer to trigger an invitation. I can't pull some old offer I had from years ago and use that to make you offer a higher number. It can't be contingent on the sale of the buyer's property because that creates additional problems. So if the competing offer is a really good offer, but only if the buyer sells their house in Tennessee, that's not going to trigger an invitation to escalate according to this provision. Similarly, if the buyer has pre-occupancy requirements, hey seller, I'm offering a great purchase price, but I have to be able to live in your house for 85 days before we close. That's a very different term than someone saying, here's my purchase price, I'll buy it in 30 days, you can live in your house until closing. Once the buyer does receive a competing offer, though, a valid competing offer, that evidence of the competing offer essentially triggers the buyer's right to say yes or no. When the seller sends their competing offer to the buyer then has a right to either accept the terms and modify their offer to amend their offer and beat this competing one, or the buyer can simply let it go and say, I can't beat that better offer, or I don't want to beat that better offer. And so at all times, this is a discretionary invitation to escalate. It essentially is not an automatic process, but instead a buyer showing the maximum extent of their willingness to negotiate with the full understanding that they do not inherently have to bind themselves. It does still cost the buyer something because they do have to show the seller what their maximum extent on certain terms are, but it does not create automatic problems. The section after section 10 is seller waiver. The seller will be deemed to have waived their right to invoke an escalation if they ever accept the offer. So if a buyer sends in an offer with an invitation to escalate and the seller simply says, I accept your offer, you cannot force escalation afterwards. There is no forcing of escalation in any case using the invitation to escalate, but there's no further step involved. Once you mutually accept the terms of the contract, those are the terms you're bound to. So when a seller gets an offer from a buyer, their options are, you can accept the offer without the escalation. It's the only buyer offer you got in the last 6 months and you don't want to wait any longer. Just accept the offer. You don't need to escalate. That's great. You can demand the escalations and see if the buyer will accept those terms. Essentially, you provide an educated counteroffer. Hey, buyer, I demand escalations. Here's a competing offer that had a higher purchase price. Would you like to accept this counteroffer? I'm pretty confident you will because you just told me you're willing to go up to this number. Or you can just counteroffer in the classic sense. Hey, buyer, irregardless of your invitation to escalate, I would like you to offer the following terms. I'm willing to accept if you're willing to accept. You can just do a regular counteroffer, or you can just reject the offer. Those 4 options exist for the seller whenever they receive a buyer offer, particularly when you've got an invitation to escalate. If the seller does not invoke the escalation and simply accepts the contract, you have bound yourself to those terms. Any subsequent changes after mutual acceptance requires a mutual amendment agreed to by both of the parties. So the seller can't simply move the purchase price because they want to. The parties have to agree to that change. The last piece here is section 12. It is a seller escalation counteroffer. By signing this, the seller essentially says, here is my counteroffer. Seller is going to provide a competing offer that has redacted information. Hey, buyer, here's what somebody else was willing to offer. Based on this better offer that I have, would you be willing to modify your offer? Here are the terms I would like to see. I counteroffer that I would like to see you agree to this by the following day, and with the following purchase price or the following modification to the terms. I want you to waive your inspection because somebody else waived their inspection. And if the seller signs here, it's a counteroffer. Sending this to the buyer operates as a counteroffer where you have pre-filled in the terms, knowing essentially that the buyer is willing to make these changes. The last piece here is section 13. It's the third chunk of the invitation to escalate. It is a 3-part dance. The buyer makes the invitation to escalate with their offer. The seller counteroffers and says, here's what somebody else did. And the buyer gets to say yes or no. If the buyer agrees to the invitation to escalate, and agrees to escalate, they essentially say, we agree and are bound to the following terms. I will change the purchase price as you stated in the earlier section. I will change the terms based on what you asked for. I will make these changes. The buyer doesn't have to agree. The buyer can say, this is too rich for me. I can't make that change. Hindsight, don't want to lose my inspection rights. That's for the buyer to make their decision for. But what this means is you will never have a situation where a buyer agrees to a contract and then after the fact, after you're under contract, terms change and parties become upset. Instead, all of the agreement is done before mutual acceptance. If someone was bluffing, if the buyer was bluffing and they sent an invitation to escalate that was simply a pie-in-the-sky offer, and the seller calls them on that offer, the buyer says no, the seller never has to be involved with that buyer. They can move on before that even becomes a problem. That is the invitation to escalate.